Frias, and I am on the Society of Professional Journalists New England Pro Chapter Board. And today we're having a discussion about DACA and LGBTQ ruling from the Supreme Court just last Monday, I believe. So we have two esteemed guests. I will be describing who they are in just a couple seconds. Thank you guys both for taking the time out of your day to explain your reporting and why these issues are important and why the people impacted, kind of what the impact is on people. So that's great. So we have Sarah Betancourt. She's an immigration reporter for Commonwealth Magazine, a former reporter for Dig Boston, the Boston Globe, and the Associated Press. She received the 2018 Investigative Reporter and Editors Award for her role in ProPublica and NPR story. They got her at work and then they got deported. So hi, Sarah, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And then we have Jeremy Fox. Jeremy C. Fox is a Boston Globe reporter and Harvard Extension School instructor. Serves as president of the Boston chapter of NLGA, is that right? The Association of LGBTQ Journalists, is a board member of the New England Society of News Editors, NESD, of Unity Boston, of Unity Boston as well, which is a coalition of journalists for diversity. So thank you for being here, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jordan. Glad to be here. Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you. So yeah, about a week ago, a little bit more now, the Supreme Court did its ruling on Title VII, I believe, and that is in regards to LGBT in the workplace. So just want to talk to you about kind of what that decision was and what you did for your reporting.
Sure. So the court decided a week ago today that basically LGBTQ people are protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which includes protections on the basis of sex. So in the past, it has always been interpreted to mean that you couldn't discriminate against somebody because they were a woman or because they were a man, and that interpretation has broadened somewhat over time. And now the court under Trump-appointed Justice Neil Gorsuch has found that those protections extend to LGBTQ people as well. My reporting, I did kind of a short piece last week where we rounded up some of the reaction from local people in the LGBTQ community who have been fighting for some of these issues, many of them for many years. I spoke with Arlene Isaacson, the co-chairwoman of the Mass Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus, who is one of the people who was behind the passage in 1989 of state law here that protects lesbian and gay people, although full protections for transgender people didn't come along later, but provides a lot of the same protections and actually even more protections. So people in Massachusetts have been in a pretty good shape on these measures for a long time relative to people in other states around the country, but around half of the LGBTQ people in this country live in states or areas that previously did not have any kind of protections. It was a patchwork of state laws and local laws before. Now these federal protections mean that a lot of people don't have things to worry about that they might have had to worry about a week ago.
Great, and you mentioned Justice Neil Gorsuch. We're going to talk about him a little bit later, but he's the one who wrote the opinion for it. So thank you for that. Okay, Sarah. So Sarah, we have DACA that was ruled on Friday morning, I believe. So can you tell us a little bit more about what DACA is and what this ruling means?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court ruling on DACA on Thursday was a little bit of a surprise to a lot of advocates and immigration attorneys from what I heard when I was interviewing experts. But basically, DACA is a program launched by President Obama in 2012 through an executive action, and it allows law-abiding young immigrants that fit into certain parameters, like not having committed any crimes in their youth and having been present in the US before 2007, to get driver's license, work permits, and the ability to go to college. So DACA allows you to have a social security number, and it sort of has helped about 800,000 young immigrants come out of the shadows. And most of those immigrants were brought to the U.S. as children by their parents, often, coming here on a visitor visa and then staying beyond the limit of that. So because they were here illegally, a lot of them remained undocumented until this happened. And so in 2017, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions challenged that and said, we are rescinding the program. So the Supreme Court ended up having to deal with 4 lawsuits sort of rolled into one big one. And that's what the 5-4 ruling was about last week, in which they ruled in favor of the DACA recipients. But the catch is they didn't actually rule that DACA is unconstitutional. And we'll get into that in a bit.
Right, and the opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts, is that correct? Or we'll get into that soon too. For Jeremy, so for you, so Sarah mentioned how Jeff Sessions was the one who rescinded the program, and I'm sure that's what kind of rolled into this whole, you reaching the Supreme Court and all that. So can you tell us the people behind why this ruling was now, why this case was brought up, or cases were brought up?
It's a similar situation to what Sarah described with the DACA case, where this was 3 different cases that were combined. There were cases of 2 gay men and 1 transgender woman who had all been fired. And, why now? I think largely because the Supreme Court decided to take the case last year. There have been cases like this percolating over the years. Obviously, we are at a point now where there is a lot more widespread support and understanding and inclusion of LGBTQ people in this country, a lot less opposition to LGBTQ Americans having full rights. But this is, as I said, talking with some people who have been in the movement for decades, this is something that was a very long time in coming, and something that a lot of other Western countries have moved on more quickly than the United States has. There have been movements for an Equality Act that would include LGBTQ Americans going back to 1974, when it was introduced by New York Representative Bella Abzug. A version of the Equality Act was passed in the House last year, but has not been taken up by the Republican-controlled Senate. So, this is part of this kind of, ongoing movement where we're seeing more and more progress, but we're also, everybody that I talk to and a lot of people who I've read who have commented on this say there's still a lot more to be done. People say, or it seems like some people got the impression that after the Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that same-sex marriage was protected across the nation, that like LGBTQ people stopped having issues or concerns, that we were not struggling anymore. And for cisgender white gay person like me, life is not necessarily that difficult. But one thing that we've also seen increasingly in the last several weeks, as we've seen so many marches and rallies in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, is the Black Trans Lives Matter movement, and which is trying very hard to bring attention to the fact that, of all the people in this country who are oppressed and belittled and demeaned and mistreated and subjected to violence, nobody probably suffers more than trans people of color. So, this is a really huge moment. This is something that a lot of people have called the biggest moment in the struggle for gay rights since it began over 50 years ago. Because everybody needs to work, pretty much. Not everybody wants to or needs to or will seek to get married, but it's also it's an important milestone in a fight that is still continuing, just like the DACA fight isn't resolved or going away.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Equality Act and kind of like what's next, what's the next fight, kind of. Sarah, can you talk about kind of what advocates are saying or people impacted saying about what's next? I mean, DACA, again, there wasn't a ruling on DACA. So can you talk about exactly what the ruling was and what's next for these people?
Yeah, so it was a 5-4 ruling. Chief Justice Roberts ended up siding with the more liberal judges. And in that decision, Roberts called Trump's move in 2017 and Sessions' move arbitrary and capricious, specifically saying that the end of DACA in 2017 failed to adhere to procedures required by administrative law. So he was basically saying that, okay, we're not saying that the program itself is unconstitutional. We're saying that the means by which you went about ending it was not constitutional. So that pretty much means that now the decision sort of punted it back to the Department of Homeland Security, which has a branch called U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services that proctors DACA applications. So you file there and they make the decision. But they haven't been accepting any new applications since 2017. So in Massachusetts, there's about 5,600 people with DACA right now, a lot of students. But there's about 21,000 more young people that could qualify for the protections that DACA gives. But even with this decision, they're unable to apply for DACA. Like, this decision doesn't mean, okay, USCIS is now accepting DACA applications. Right now, it just means people who had it in 2017 or who renewed, they can continue renewing. So it's sort of a Band-Aid solution. So a lot of people were really excited about last week's decision, but they sort of see this as a temporary measure. And a lot of the DACA recipients, attorneys, and experts I talked to were like, okay, this resolves something briefly, but the alternative is passing the Dream and Promise Act. They're actually putting this into legislation. And right now, that's something that the House of Representatives passed, I think it was a little bit over a year ago, but the Senate hasn't taken up. And so that bill would create a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients and those who want to enroll in the program. But because of the political schisms that exist in Washington, that has not made it to a Senate vote or even a Senate debate.
Thank you for that. So you guys both mentioned kind of like how this, there are these bills, right, that the House voted on that are like democratically controlled House voted on that the Senate's not taking up. Can you talk a little bit more about people that might see these decisions might think, hey, you know, this is 2020. People are more accepting of LGBTQ people, like you said, Jeremy. I'm assuming there's a lot of support for the Dreamers, the people under DACA, Sarah. So well, Jeremy, start first. Can you guys talk a little bit more about, do you guys think the popularity and the way the country's moving played into this, or not at all? And Jeremy, you start first, and Sarah, you pick up. That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a ruling that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. It's a ruling that we may not have been ready for 5 years ago when the court ruled on marriage. It's not, I mean, the Supreme Court sometimes leads the country, sometimes is willing to step out a little bit further than the mainstream, but usually follows the mainstream. And I think on both these issues, probably, you know, polls show most Americans don't think I should get fired because I have a boyfriend. Like, what does that have to do with my job? I wanted to add real quick also before I hand the floor back to Sarah, similar to what she was saying about you know, the ongoing questions and issues about DACA and pushback from the Trump administration. After the decision based on Title VII last week, a lot of people were saying, well, now this means that the Trump administration won't be able to go through with cuts to health care protections for transgender Americans, like the administration had said just the Friday before that they would. And last Friday, they made clear that they are still pursuing that, and that they think they're going to get away with it. A lot of this is going to continue to play out in courts and appeals courts, and maybe eventually some things are going to get back to the Supreme Court over the years as we see exactly how far these protections can be extended, what the federal government or state governments or individuals might be able to get away with that you know, is somehow a loophole in there, or might be excluded for other reasons.
Thank you for that. Sarah?
And the same goes for DACA. Like, for instance, President Trump had a bit of a controversial rally in Tulsa this weekend. And he said, he sort of painted it as a victory for his administration, even though his administration lost on a technicality. And he said, we're planning on refiling it. And so what refiling means during an election year is really up in the air. Some of the experts that I talked to for this story, specifically Harvard professor and sociologist Roberto Gonzalez, he's been studying DACA since the inception of DACA in 2012, and he's interviewed thousands of DACA recipients. And he was like, well, this decision puts the ball back in the Trump administration's court, but I don't expect they're going to move on terminating the program soon, specifically. So either way, if the Supreme Court had decided against this, there wouldn't be an immigration services officer showing up at people's doors saying you're deported in 1 week. I mean, when your status gets changed like this, and even in a worst case scenario, you still have to go through immigration court. And right now, because of COVID-19, coronavirus, immigration courts are backed up through 2023 and 2024. So people would probably have had deportation orders, but they would have had to wait a very long time before they even saw a judge. Now, what it means moving forward with the Trump administration is right now it seems like he's blowing a lot of hot air. He could refile this as a lawsuit, but whether or not that would be a wise decision during an election year, especially when about 90% of the American public supports a pathway to citizenship, according to numerous polls, including a recent CBS poll, is questionable. Like, if you would really want to pick that fight during an election year.
Yeah, so you mentioned about like how Trump kind of keeps talking about he's going to go back and get rid of this unlawful program, he calls it. So Jeremy, I mean, we don't really hear much from Trump about the ruling from Monday. Am I right with that, or did you hear differently about Trump's?
He made a couple of public comments in the immediate aftermath of that ruling on Monday. He was pretty mild in his response. He said that he had read the ruling and that it was very compelling, I think is the word he used. And then I think subsequently, after the DACA decision, he has made some more forceful statements about the Supreme Court that seem to kind of criticize them for both decisions. But yeah, he had... Trump's record on the LGBTQ community is a really odd one, from the time pretty early in his election campaign back in 2015, 2016, he tried to court LGBTQ voters in a way that Republican candidates have not in the past, and said he was a friend to the community and that he was going to do good things for the community. And then he got into office and started trying to remove transgender people from the military and remove protections for healthcare and protections in the workplace and all kinds of other things. So, but again, it's the kind of thing where he pays attention to it for a little while, and then he seems to get distracted or busy with something else. And this isn't one of the issues that the president is constantly flogging like certain other issues.
Yeah, Sarah, so why do you think that is? So like I was watching a Sunday show yesterday, and they had Chad Wolf on. He's the acting Secretary of Homeland Security. And he was saying, oh yeah, the DACA program that Obama created is unlawful. It's not popular. He should have got public opinion. We're going to definitely fight it. Why do you think they're so antagonistic about this program compared to a ruling about LGBT rights in the workplace?
So DACA is just part of this broader debate about immigration, and inherently during the Trump administration, what's become part of the immigration debate is the border wall. So for instance, this bill that currently exists in Congress, Trump has said over the past 2 years, I want to help the DACA recipients, but you know what? Congress should do something. And Congress has tried doing something. But the problem is with the Dream and Promise Act, which would create a pathway to citizenship for these young immigrants, Republicans would like to tack on certain things, which include funding for a border wall, something that Democrats won't approve. So it's an issue of there's no straight Dream Act anymore. And it's, I mean, the Dream Act is something that dates back to 2001. It actually used to be quite bipartisan. The original filers were a Democrat and a Republican back then. But now it's become something far more complex, and any bills that exist become things that everyone wants to add something onto. And that's why it hasn't passed. But you know, perhaps the Supreme Court decision might change that. The election in November and who ends up in the White House come January may change that. So we really have to see what happens moving forward.
Yeah, I just want to real quickly say, I mean, I think the difference between the two is immigration is a real red meat issue for Trump's base, and Trump's base doesn't really care so much about LGBTQ people. Like the rest of the country, they have moved to a state of acknowledging and maybe begrudgingly our presence, but they're not exercised about it in the same way that people are exercised about immigration issues.
Yeah, immigration issues seem to be, I think, red meat is the best way to describe it. I mean, if you go to a Trump rally, the wall is always mentioned. Immigration is always mentioned. And that's something that's a little bit different than past presidents.
So Sarah, in your reporting, you mentioned earlier, you talked about how Justice Roberts ruled that's arbitrary and capricious, the way that they went through this. And you quote the Carol Rose of the ACLU of Massachusetts, who said that it's a political, not legal decision. Is she basically agreeing that that the decision ultimately made was just a process decision, not actual anything to do with immigration? Or
I mean, I think the ACLU does see this as a victory, and a pretty significant one, especially since so many people thought, well, I wouldn't necessarily say the ACLU thought this, but because this was an executive order, is this something that could just be rolled back by any administration that came after the Obama administration? So there were a lot of people in the immigrant community did not think this was going to be what came out, and especially on an administrative law technicality. And this is the second time the Trump administration has lost on a technical issue like administrative law. The first time was with the census. So this is definitely something I'm sure the administration's attorneys are reflecting upon on what they can refile next, as the president said at the Tulsa rally this weekend. But I think the ACLU, like most immigration advocates, were saying, well, you know, this is a victory, and their decision to abandon the program was not exactly something initially founded on legal basis, but because it's immigration related, it was a political decision. They're probably the least quoted in the story, but I know Attorney General Maura Healey, for instance, who was one of the additional attorney generals who signed on to a couple of the lawsuits that made it to the Supreme Court that sort of got melted into each other for this final decision that was considered. She said, you know, this is a victory, but we would like to see something codified into law, like something a little more solid than a president's executive action, so that during every single administration, we're not going to be having this debate based on politics.
So when you talked about, we talked about how Chief Justice Roberts' decision was, like, you know, his words were really important. Jeremy, can you talk about how the words of Neil Gorsuch were important for this ruling? What stood out to you, and do you think there's, question for both of you guys, do you think there's too much focus on the people who made this decision rather than the decision itself?
And well, that's an interesting question. I think I might do these in reverse. But the issue of, I mean, Sarah pointed out earlier, I think, you know, we're dealing with some Republican appointees and specifically Trump appointees who have been behind some of these decisions, and certainly none of this would be possible without the support of, you know, some of these justices who are not considered to be among the four liberal justices. So, you know, to see Gorsuch and Roberts being the authors of these two opinions, I think is really interesting. And to see even Kavanaugh's opinion in the Title VII case on LGBTQ rights, he was much more moderate in his opinion than the one that was written by Justice Alito and co-signed by Justice Thomas, which was, you know, much more like, you know, what we would have seen in the old days from Justice Scalia or somebody like that. You know, the presidents who appoint Supreme Court justices always try to predict what they're going to do, and they are quite often wrong. And I don't know. I mean, we will see. We talked earlier about them being influenced by public opinion. I've got to think that that's a factor there. You know, when you think about especially some of these younger justices in their 50s, you know, they have sons and daughters who are in high school and college and have young friends. And, you know, if you talk to people that age, if you talk to the Zillennials, their attitudes about inclusion are, you know, miles apart from the attitudes of our earlier generations. Having said that, getting back to Gorsuch's opinion in the LGBTQ case, one of the things that was really interesting and significant was that he, in his opinion, basically paraphrased an argument that was made before the court, and an argument that LGBTQ people and attorneys have been making for a long time, that if you treat somebody differently because of the gender of who they love or the gender that they identify for themselves, then that is just on its face, that is based on sex. If Sarah can marry a man and keep her job, and I'm Sarah's coworker and I marry a man and lose my job, I'm getting discriminated on. I'm getting discriminated against because of my sex. And that's an argument that has been made for a long time, from what I understand, and we have not seen it, you know, coming back to us with support from a Supreme Court justice.
Thank you. And Sarah, two things. So your response to, is there too much focus on the decision, not the actual people impacted? And can you talk more about the people behind this movement to have DACA and keep it going?
Jordan, can you repeat the first part of your question?
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. I think my father's coming home and the garage is shaking. Sorry about that. The first question part is just like, do you think there's too much focus on the decision itself, who made it, rather than the actual impact it's having and people behind it?
I mean, the people who made the decision being the Supreme Court justices, I mean, there's a call right now for Chief Justice Roberts to resign by conservatives. And that's been posted on some more prominent conservative blogs in the past 48 hours, which I find to be really interesting. I thought in terms of the LGBTQ decision that the Gorsuch authoring of the opinion was interesting, because he's a proponent of originalism. He's considered a justice that interprets the Constitution as it was written. And when you think about when the Constitution was written, it sort of blows your mind that you're relying on ideologies from 287 years ago. But I think the DACA decision was a little bit different. And the fact that Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion doesn't exactly surprise me, because he's sort of known for being this deciding figure and sort of being, sort of what the vice president is like when there's a tie within one of the houses of representatives. He goes to break the vote. But I think even more important about this decision is like the people who it impacts. So we have a lot of students who have DACA, a lot of young immigrant families. A couple people I interviewed, for instance, one is a woman who was brought here when she was 10 from Peru. And she is now married to another DACA recipient, and this is Pamela in the story. And she just had a baby girl. Her daughter is a US citizen. She works for one of the higher education institutions here in Boston as a researcher. And she's, she was pretty nervous about thinking about what this could have meant in the event that she was deported. Now, she understood that, even if the Supreme Court decided against the DACA recipients last Thursday, she knew no one's was gonna knock on her door, but she knew down the road, over the next 3 or 4 years, there would have been a situation where she would have had to apply for a stay of removal, which is basically you petitioning the federal government saying, please let me remain here for these reasons. And having a child is a reason. Now, for some of the other younger DACA recipients who are students, for instance, like Stephanie Pineda, they don't have the option of saying, I have a child or I have more links to the US. So that would make them even more at risk of being deported, 3-4 years down the road. So for Stephanie, I mean, she started UMass Boston the day that Jeff Sessions announced the rescinding of DACA. So that was like quite a first day of college. And now she's in her last year, but she and Pamela both described this idea of not wanting to live 2 years to 2 years, because if you're a DACA recipient, you have to apply for this status and, provide a bunch of paperwork about your life. Every 2 years, pay about $500. And every 2 years, you have that, few month period where you're nervous it's not going to be renewed again. So they're both supporters of like a permanent pathway to citizenship, and both of them can't imagine going back to their home countries of Honduras or Peru, because they haven't lived there since they were age 4 and age 10. But the personal impact on their life, now that they're able to continue renewing due to the Supreme Court decision, they can have a driver's license and get to and from work. They have a social security number, which means they can legally get a work permit. And it also means that they can apply for health insurance. Now, DACA recipients aren't able to get Medicare, for instance, but they're able to apply for private insurance. And in some states, it's all depending on state law, they can apply for public health insurance through the state. So it does have a significant impact on DACA recipients who have pre-existing medical conditions, for instance. Because if someone lost their social security number next week, they would lose their health insurance, and then that $3 inhaler becomes $300. So that's like the impact of the decision.
Yeah, thank you for laying that out, because I'm not gonna lie, I was listening to a podcast a week before the decision, and I heard somebody speak about their experience. I'm like, she's like, I can't be able to work if I don't have DACA anymore. I'm like, oh yeah, like you hear about DACA so much, but you forget the actual, what it does and what it protects. So, but thank you for that, for laying that out for us, as you did in your article. Jeremy, for people impacted, like Sarah, illustrated all these people. Some people live in Massachusetts who are impacted. So why, this is kind of a silly question, but why should people in Massachusetts care? I mean, you said Massachusetts already has these kind of protections. And do you think people even knew that people were getting fired over who they loved or who they identified as?
Well, that's the kind of thing, like every few months, there's a story that comes up of, like a teacher at a Catholic school marries a same-sex partner somewhere in the Midwest, and on Monday walked into the school and was told that they were fired. Stuff like that happens periodically. Historically, it has been a huge concern. Historically, it's one of the reasons why so many gay people, LGBTQ people lived in the closet for decades and decades, because they feared firing, because they feared being ostracized, unable to support themselves. So this has historically been a huge issue in the community. And, we have protections here in Massachusetts. We have protections in about half of the rest of the country before this decision, but half of the country did not have those protections. And, a lot of people are mobile for their jobs. People move from one state to another. And, you talk about the issue of having to reapply every 2 years for DACA and provide all of this documentation, and just what a hassle and how much stress that is. And I've seen people, not DACA recipients, but I've seen people in my own life who were stressed out about whether they were going to get their green card or whether they were going to get a visa renewal. And I know what an impact that has on people's lives. Well, for many years, for members of the LGBTQ community, if you move from one city to another city, from one state to another state, your laws change, your rights changed with the laws wherever you went. So the more that these laws become federalized, the safer that we all are. The more, and I think too, having a protection under federal law has a weight that having a protection under state law doesn't necessarily have. But there are also exceptions to this, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when it guarantees protections in the workplace, it only applies to workplaces that employ 15 or more people. So smaller workplaces, you still could have to worry about being fired. And I mean, how many times have we heard in the news or in our own lives of people who got fired, and one reason was presented, but there was another reason why the person who was fired thinks that they got fired. And if you're working at will with your employer able to hire or fire anybody at any time without providing a cause for the firing, then people still have to worry about that. So like Sarah used the term Band-Aid before about the DACA decision. This is really big, and it's really helpful. It's really important in a lot of ways, but there are definitely things that it doesn't cover, and there are people who are still worried, still have valid reason for concerns.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I didn't think about that. So maybe it's hard to tell, but maybe some people will be more, open about who they are, who they love now with this decision. Sarah, do you think there's going to be more people applying for DACA, or are more interested in it now that it's what happened?
I mean, I think the people who, so there's two groups. There's the people who had DACA on, what was it, August 20, 2017, when Jeff Sessions said, all right, we're going to rescind the program, we're going to end this program, but we're going to give the people who currently have it the option to renew it within the next couple of weeks. And for some people, like, if they applied on December 2015, they usually would have had a couple more months to renew their DACA. Everyone flooded and tried to rush through it and apply in that 2-week period. But often DACA recipients need an attorney, they need help getting paperwork. 2 weeks is not a lot of time. So a lot of people were either unable to renew, unable to apply in that 2-week period, and they were just known as people who, if they had applied, would have gotten it, but they didn't have the opportunity to do that. So like I said, in Massachusetts, there's usually, there were about 6,800 people. That number has actually gone down because some DACA recipients, get married to a US citizen because they've been here and they go to school with someone and meet someone. Or they've, left the country officially, and that usually doesn't happen, but it's happened in a couple cases. So the number that remains is about 5,400 to 5,600 people who have DACA, but they could renew it. And then there's another 21,000 people that if they could legally apply and get it, they would get it. and they would pass the many, many legal hoops that you need to go through in order to get it. So I don't think there's going to be an influx of people who are trying to apply for DACA because they know this doesn't mean that you can apply. This just means the people who had it can keep it for the time being. But of course, advocates want the Dream and Promise Act to go through because it would create a pathway to citizenship. And the other thing that the government could do, but probably will not do, the Department of Homeland Security specifically, is to expand the parameters of DACA. And considering Trump's comments during the Tulsa rally, I doubt that'll happen, but they could say, okay, we're gonna re-expand this. Instead of making it, you had to be here before 2007, we're now saying you had to be here before 2012. Like, they can change all of that around, but they're not doing that.
Well, you guys both seem very knowledgeable about your topics. Can you talk a little bit more, Jeremy first and then Sarah, about kind of the pre-reporting that's been done, kind of how close you've been following this, and how you found out, how you determined who you wanted to talk to for your pieces?
It's a lot of different things. I mean, I have covered issues in the LGBTQ community off and on, and you know, some of the folks who I spoke with when I did my reporting are folks that I've spoken. I mean, you know, Attorney General Maura Healey is somebody who I have spoken to for many different stories, certainly not just for stories about the LGBTQ community. You know, some of what I know and my understanding of these issues comes from being a member of the community and talking with other people, and also with reading a lot. But you know, I think the sourcing is incredibly important, and you know, if there are young journalists out there listening who are interested in my thoughts on this, you know, I saw shortly after my piece went up, I saw a trans woman who's very active on Twitter who tweeted out a bunch of coverage from other news organizations that didn't quote anybody who's transgender. And this is an issue. It's really an issue that affects transgender people, I think, more than it affects cisgender queer people for the most part. Those of us who you know, can sort of blend into a workplace more seamlessly have an advantage that a lot of transgender people don't always have. And so it's important to consider the perspectives. I saw that and I was like, oh, thank God, I didn't interview one transgender person in my story. But I only had like 5 quoted sources in the story, and it was written kind of quickly. We should be thinking a lot about that. But I mentioned Arlene Isaacson, who is, you know, kind of a pioneer on these issues, who's been fighting these fights since I was in junior high, if not elementary school. And who else did I quote? I quoted a statement from Mary Bonato from GLAAD, 1A GLAAD, used to be Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders. The name is now GLBTQ Legal Defenders or something. I forget exactly what it is, but that's an organization in Boston that has been here also since the 70s, that has been advocating in court. Mary Bonato was one of the people who argued in front of the Supreme Court in the Obergefell case. So, you know, knowing who the people are in the community who are influential, knowing that, to be 100% honest with you, there are some LGBTQ organizations that do a lot more, and some LGBTQ organizations that put out a lot of press releases. I try to quote the ones that are really out there doing the work in the field, and I try as much as I can, you know, to quote people like Arlene and like Trey Andre Valentine from the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, who are really living these issues every single day and out there fighting and advocating and marching and speaking in public.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Sarah? How about your sources and your pre-reporting and all that?
Well, so I sort of became aware of people who were undocumented in a sort of different way. I grew up in Vermont, which is primarily white, but I worked in a greenhouse. My first job when I was 15, loading tomato plants onto the back of trucks. And I realized that there were a lot of people who were immigrants working there after the hours that I worked there that made a lot less. And I found out, they didn't have papers. And so that sort of got me interested in who this, shadow population was. And during school, like at Emerson College, there were a couple immigrant classmates, and right after I graduated from like 2010 to 2012, there were a lot of protests about trying to push the Dream and Promise Act, this idea of DACA. So I remember when President Obama announced this. And so I sort of followed it over the years. In grad school, I was stuck in an immigration reporting class. And at first I was like, well, I want to write about something a little bit different other than reactionary reporting. So I started thinking about how do people with DACA and undocumented immigrants in general get health insurance? Sort of these things that people don't typically talk about on ABC or like just general breaking news. So I started talking with experts. I kept in touch with them. When this story came about, I'd already reported on DACA for Commonwealth and the AP and some other places that I worked previously. So Boston's small enough where you still keep in touch with people. You can call them up. I called a few people up in the previous days before, including a Stephanie who I had on a podcast about a year ago, and said, I'm sure you're keeping track of this. Let's talk. And let's talk the morning of, because I want to talk to you right after you've heard the decision to see what your reaction is. And then I thought it was important, not just speaking to actual immigrants, beyond immigrant rights groups, because some immigrant rights groups are led by immigrants, but some aren't. So I always think it's important to actually talk to immigrants. But additionally, to talk to some of these experts, like for instance, Roberto and Attorney General Healy know their stuff in regards to immigration law. And I definitely wanted expert sources, not just to have reactionary reporting about this is the decision that just came out from the Supreme Court, but also legally, what does this mean moving forward? Because there were a lot of questions in the community. Like I got a few messages from people saying, wait a minute, does this mean my cousin who doesn't have DACA, who would probably be able to get it, can he apply? And I was like, actually, no, not unless the Department of Homeland Security decides to change its rules. So.
Thank you for that. I guess my last question before I push it to the audience is going to be more about like, are there stories that you guys see that kind of follow these decisions? Or is there, as a reporter who wants to keep following these decisions, the people impacted, what are some ideas you have? Is there something you can work on, you think, or is this kind of like, wait, we have to wait until the next thing gets debated or passed or whatever? Jeremy, you can go first.
I think there are tons of stories out there about people who were affected by this. I mean, particularly less so stories about the LGBTQ issue in Massachusetts, perhaps, because folks here have been protected for 30 years. But so many other places around the country, there, if you go into your community and start interviewing LGBTQ people, you will find people who lost their jobs, and honestly, like you could find it in Massachusetts too. This is maybe 15 years ago, but I knew a transgender woman who couldn't get a job working at Macy's because I cannot even imagine why. She was a very attractive transgender woman who, presented as a traditionally beautiful cisgender woman, and she also was a drag performer. She wanted to sell makeup at a makeup counter at Macy's, and I don't think they would even interview her for the job. Like people get discriminated against all the time. That was 15 years ago in Boston, but it might have happened last week too, as far as I know. And think about, like I said, workplaces smaller than 15, at will employees, people who don't have unions to protect them, people who can't afford lawyers. And this got a lot of attention in the news, but a lot of people don't know their rights. And even when we cover something wall to wall, and it's the top of page one of every newspaper, some people don't know what the protections that they have are, and they don't know how to seek help to ensure that they avail themselves of those protections. So this Supreme Court decision did not mean everybody who's queer now goes to work with 100% safety and job security and confidence that management is behind them. People are still struggling, and people are going to struggle. And, the people who are the most oppressed and easiest to target and most vulnerable are going to continue to be vulnerable and to be the most oppressed and the most targeted in these situations.
How about you, Sarah?
So I think moving forward, right now it's a waiting game in terms of what is DHS or USCIS going to say. So for instance, last week they put out a couple press statements Thursday night, and USCIS in particular was pretty stringent in saying this was an illegal decision. And it was like, okay, you're reacting, but what are you gonna do next? Like, what are the actual parameters you're gonna put in place moving forward? So as of right now, current DACA recipients can apply for renewal, but everything else is unknown. And it'll continue to be unknown until these specific agencies lay out what comes next. And I'm sure that'll mean a lot for a lot of people.
Yeah, it sounds like what happens in December is going to be a huge issue, because it sounds like on one end we have very anti-immigrant sentiments from different departments and different agencies. But also, Jeremy, I mean, you talked about Trump trying to say he's a friend of the LGBTQ community, but I mean, his vice president is Mike Pence, who has not the greatest record on LGBTQ rights. So I'm assuming that it's obvious that this president and his administration is going to target immigrants, but I think even LGBTQ isn't determined as safe as well. Is that fair to say?
Certainly. I mean, the Trump administration on Friday reaffirmed they're going to try to take protections away from transgender people in healthcare situations. And just think about, when I spoke just a moment ago about the people who are the most vulnerable and the people who are the most oppressed, people who are transgender need access to quality health care as much as anybody, if not more than the average person. Transgender people often require hormone interventions and surgeries in order to live in a way that is comfortable to them. And when people don't have access to quality medical care and they start seeking stuff on the black market, which sometimes happens, people die, people wind up, with serious injuries and debilitating conditions. It's a really serious issue, and it's just an issue of human rights and compassion. Why should any transgender person be denied access to the health care that anybody else would have?
And Sarah, there's also, it's not just DACA. I mean, when you talk about immigration, you're also talking about mixed status families. You're talking about different types of visas, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's over 185 different kinds of visas, not including certain protected statuses like medical deferred action, which was a fight last summer in which basically the Citizenship and Immigration Services, part of the Department of Homeland Security, announced that immigrants, mostly children in the US, who had these work permits and protected statuses. So this means they can't be deported. They were all critically ill, medically ill immigrants in hospitals. I interviewed a 10-year-old, a 16-year-old. They were told they had 33 days to leave the country, along with their parents, brothers, and sisters, because their protected status was no longer being honored by the federal government, and that once those 33 days were up, if they had not voluntarily left the country, they would be moved into removal proceedings or deportation. And that story, and then national news started covering this after we broke it, basically became a national story. There were a bunch of congressional hearings, and this was actually the first time the Trump administration reversed its decision. So on September 21st, they decided, actually, we're not going to rescind the program. And that meant a lot to a lot of people, just because, one, for a lot of these patients who could not get medical treatment in their home countries in a way that Boston hospitals or American institutions could offer, there was no way they were going to be ready to go in 33 days. And also for their families that had established lives here temporarily, it meant they could continue to keep working to pay their kids' hospital bills. And that was pretty significant. So that was actually, I mean, it was a small, tiny program, nowhere near as huge as DACA. But it was the first major Trump loss when it came to immigration. And right now people are talking about potential changes in visas, student visas, farm worker visas because of COVID-19 and the adjustments that has had and impacts it's had on the economy. But that's going to be an issue that's going to be rolling out over the summer. Yeah.
So it sounds like when it comes to these topics of immigration or these communities like immigrants and LGBTQ, there's going to be plenty more to report. So that's good to know.
Always.
So I'm just going to ask Abby if you have any questions. I can't really tell since I'm on my phone. Abby, do we have any questions from the audience by any chance?
No, not really. I added a question, but
Could you ask it?
It was part of it was covered in the
Okay.
discussion. I was just wondering if the two of you are hopeful that some of the fears that people had about these Trump-appointed judges overturning past decisions, if you're worried about that, or if you think we might get some more surprising decisions, like the DACA one, for example, and the LGBTQ workplace rights as well, and to some extent.
Whoever wants to go first?
In regards to immigration-related decisions, I'm not too hopeful. I really think that DACA recipients benefited in this situation because the Trump administration's attorneys were not quite versed in administrative law and knowing that the way they rescinded DACA was improper. So now they can literally rescind it again the correct way. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Supreme Court supported the Trump administration in that circumstance.
Jeremy?
I mean, like I said earlier, obviously there are some Trump appointees and other Republican appointees on the Supreme Court who are deciding in ways the Republicans who put them there did not anticipate or look forward to. But it's hard to know what's going to happen in the future. Both of these cases, to some degree, relied on close readings of the law, and more so than they did like a big statement in support of universal human rights. The decision in the LGBTQ case was based on the idea that men and women are protected under the law, that I am protected from an employment action that would not be taken against a woman who was similarly situated. It's not an assertion that I have rights that are vested in me being a gay man. So, you know, what's going to happen next, what the next case will be and the next decision will be. I mean, I think this is why some people, you know, treat the Supreme Court like sport, because you just never can tell what they're going to wind up ruling in some of these like really hotly debated and highly anticipated cases. And I'm sorry, folks, but now that it's 3, I really have to get going because I need to cover a protest.
This is actually the last question, so it's perfect. Well, thank you guys both for your time. I really appreciate it. Again, we have Jeremy Fox from the Globe and Sarah Betancourt from Commonwealth Magazine. Thanks again for your time, and hope to talk to you again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure talking with you both, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.